Hi, everyone. I hope you're all having a good part of the semester. I know things are starting to get stressful, so I am hoping to have your outlines graded over the weekend at some point, so you should be seeing feedback from that soon. Otherwise, as always, please feel free to check in with me on anything that's coming up, and make sure that you're getting ready for that first draft of the final paper that's due in a couple of weeks. So if you haven't chosen a topic and you need some help with that, please reach out to me and let me know soon, so that you're not doing it at the last minute when perhaps I will be more overwhelmed with grading for this class or for other classes as well. So please, as always, reach out when you have questions. Today we're going to be continuing our conversation on affect. So last class we talked about Sarah Ahmed's Politics of Emotions reading, and the chapter was called Just Emotions. So that one was focused more so on the way society asks us to classify emotions differently depending on the people or the objects we're talking about. Today's reading from Brian Musami, although it's about affect, he is more concerned with the actual bodily reaction. So Ahmed is sort of taking it like, yes, it's affect, but she's also talking about emotion. Musami is like getting at the core of like, what is our body doing before we even register? And he wants to figure out, or to at least provide some examples of ways our entire society has had sort of affective reactions to certain things. So let's go ahead and get into this a little bit. So first, we'll start by defining affective fact against our understanding of a real fact, whatever real fact means. Then we'll try to identify some of Musami's suggestions, so some of his main points. And then finally, we'll discuss a couple of concepts that are important to his ideas. So operative logic and dynamical objects. So we'll get into all of that today. Typically, if you're in my class, you would take a second to do this, but as always, I suggest this just to sort of help you get through some of the readings. But instead of you doing that, I'll be doing some of that for you. So I've used this picture from September 11th, 2001, because to me, this is a really good example of a picture that gives many people an affective reaction. So before I even have time to register how I feel about this picture, and the feelings are very complex, but before I even get to those, my body starts to just sort of feel a little bit nauseous. So like my stomach hurts, there's like knots in my stomach. That signifies that you have some sort of bodily reaction to this, and that this photo has affect attached to it. So I'm using this example, and I know for some of you this is really hard to see, right? So some of you maybe had been in New York for this, so you might have a stronger affective reaction, right? But I'm using this so that we can start to think about what an affective fact is. So an affective fact is a fact that gives our body a reaction. And when I say a fact, sometimes the facts are true. And I know it sounds weird because aren't all facts supposed to be true, but think about this as like pieces of evidence rather than like a scientific fact. So typically they're true. And of course, there could still be an affective reaction to true things. Remember, because Sarah Ahmed said that we do have some relationship to like justice and other norms and our emotions and our affect, right? But sometimes affect can react to things that are not true, but we're sort of taking them as fact anyway. So a good example of this is, for example, that abortion video we talked about last week, or when, so let's just use that. So that video is actually showing body parts of a fetus, and it's banking on the fact that many of us, whether we're pro-choice or pro-life, is going to have sort of this disgusted reaction to that, right? Maybe not all of us, but most of us. And that reaction can then be utilized in the rest of the video, right? And so then that reaction is actually convincing us that there's other things in that video that is true, right? So again, affective fact is a piece of information that is tied to bodily reaction. And that piece of information isn't necessarily true. But in this reading's particular case, what Brian Musami is talking about is threat, and the way that we actually never really know if threat is true, or sometimes we never know if threat is true or not. Because what's happening with a threat is that if it doesn't actually happen, we still end up feeling as if we were threatened by the thing we thought was going to happen. And so for Musami, the threat is allowing for us to sort of reinforce as many times as we get threatened by it, our reaction. And then the government or whoever is giving us this affective reaction is going to bank on that affect as they continue to do it. A good example of this, if we want to get outside of the reading, is last semester, at the end of the semester, for those of you who are here, I know you all remember the threats against the school and against certain groups of people at the school. So for some of us, we sort of, we're like, okay, we don't think that this is true. Others of us, depending on the various traumas that we've gone through, might have felt like it was, it could have been real. So we had a variety of ways that we responded, but no matter what, even though the actual shooting, thank God, did not happen, the actual threat did not end up coming to be, we still have some weird feelings about the end of this semester, right? I mean, I can remember coming onto campus and having goosebumps, just even though, like, I wasn't one of those who had particular trauma that might have affected me and preventing me from coming, but I still felt that affect. And I didn't expect to feel it at all, right? And so now when I talk about mass shootings, I think about the days we were coming to campus when there was a threat on campus, right? And that sort of gives me a specific type of bodily reaction before I even register it in my emotions. Brian Musami also uses an example of the flower attack, which he calls it a flower attack. The media actually called it an anthrax attack, but what he's telling us with this particular example is that through the media sensationalism of this, they ended up sort of getting everyone to think that an anthrax attack had actually happened. A couple of months later, after things had been tested, it turned out that, it was actually just flour. But the way that this whole thing had been reported makes many people think that it was still anthrax. Like, they didn't spend a lot of time correcting that, I guess we'll call it an affective fact, right? That piece of information that they had guessed was true. They only sort of said, maybe at the end of a story, oh, by the way, that thing we talked about 3 months ago, it was a flower attack, not anthrax, right? And then they sort of moved on, because again, most people, as we know, most people aren't going to pay attention to something that isn't like super dramatic, right? That doesn't capture the attention of the public screen. And so this is yet another example of a threat that didn't end up being an actual thing, but still sort of complicates our relationship to things like opening up an envelope, right? All right, so let's move on and talk a bit about some of his important points that he's trying to get at when he's thinking about all of these different ways that affect is impacting us. So first of all, a really important term that he uses is something called operative logic. So operative logic is opposed to normative logic. So typically normative logic is something like, I know this to be true because people have researched it, or I have researched it. I see the quantifiable evidence, or I know many other people who have dealt with this, right? So that's a normative logic. Operative logic is one of those things where, like, you're using, as he says, you're sort of collapsing ontology and epistemology together. So you're collapsing the way that you think human beings are and how you know what you know together. So for example, if I know a particular group of individuals who I think I can't trust, even though there's no scientific evidence, that's just, gut feeling tells me I shouldn't trust people from Indiana, right? I'm from Indiana, so I'm just saying. So if I were to say that, then inform that without any sort of factual evidence, right? I just sort of I just know. And then I use that to inform the way that I know what to expect when I go to Indiana. That's me performing with operative logic. Again, the way that I guess he describes this, and maybe a little bit of an easier way to understand, is it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's something that, like, you are sort of using all those stereotypes or your expectations, even though you didn't research them, right? You only know them by your gut or by like what maybe one or two other people told you, right? And then you're just sort of allowing those to be reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. He would say that operative logic is connected to affect, right? And in fact, affective facts sort of move us into this operative logic because they make us sort of feel a particular way about a group of people or a part of the world. And so we sort of make our decisions based on our feelings, right? But we don't actually realize that we're making our decisions based on our feelings or our affect, right? And a lot of this has to do, for him at least, with fear, right, and threat. And so when you're feeling like your livelihood is going to go away, then he's thinking that, of course, you're probably not going to be thinking normatively. You're not going to be thinking in a way that seems rational, right? And politicians know this, and this is sort of something that they manipulate quite a bit. Right? Okay, so operative logic is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're sort of, as you know something about a group of people, you're using that to inform the decisions that you're doing, even though you don't have any factual evidence to inform those decisions. The last thing that we need to talk about, and this is another really important thing that's happening, connected to affective fact as well as connected to what we were just talking about. So dynamical objects are actually us. So he, at some point in the reading, one of the last, actually on page 168, he talks about dynamical objects as like fleshy, innervated things, right? They're like bodies of flesh. He's calling us dynamical objects anytime that we are moved affectively. So what he believes happens is that our brain sort of shuts off, and it's sort of like we're moving like zombies, right? And we're dynamical. We sort of move based on what the affect is telling us to do, right? So I put these two photos up because for some groups, I think one photo could turn them into a dynamical object, and then I think for other groups, the other photo could do that, right? So for some groups, this photo of ISIS is going to make them shut off sort of their logical capabilities. They start to feel fear, right? They don't even register it yet. They just start to feel it. Maybe they get, goosebumps or something, right? And then they react, right? We need to do something about them right away. On the other hand, for some others, this white supremacist on the right might give us the same sort of reaction, right? And so Brian Musami is saying we need to be careful about when no matter which side we're on, when we're turned into dynamical objects, when we're turned into zombies, sort of following along and making sure that like we get rid of whatever we think is bad. This is not to say that like in the end, we might not try to get rid of the people we think are bad, but he's trying to tell us that we need to make sure that we work through what the evidence is that tells us that we need to get rid of these people. Because he's worried that something like what happened in Iraq with, and this is what he talks about at the beginning of the reading, with George W. Bush telling us about weapons that Iraq had but actually didn't have. And he sort of got the full support of everyone because of that affective reaction, right? Especially after 9/11. Brian Musami wants us to prevent that from happening. And so he's imploring all of us who are subjects right now, who have the power to do something and to make sure that we're checking on the government, make sure that we're checking on the media, to do that rather than turn into objects. Right? So that's, when we're thinking about affect, that's really the point of studying this, is to try to establish how your body is being moved without you having control of it, and trying to establish how you can start thinking through having a little bit more control. All right, so that's all we have for today. Hopefully you understand, like if you were to use this in a paper, you would definitely need to use some of these key terms like operative logic and dynamical objects, and identify where those things are happening in whatever artifact you've chosen to use. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know. And otherwise, hopefully I will see you all soon.